back to Dad Spending Politics. It's been a little while. Timetabling has been a little sketchy for a bit. This one has been on holiday having a lovely time in Greece, and I have been toiling away over here having a nice time as well, to be honest, back in Australia. So we're back and ready to start doing, I think, regularly scheduled episodes, going forward. So first we're going to talk about the conference that happened in Bogota in Colombia the other day with an expected 30 countries, but I think it ended up being 28 countries to talk about Palestine. Then we're going to talk about the Epstein files and everything that's happening there with Congress and Trump, etc. Then we're going to go back to Australia. We're going to talk about Albo's trip to China and everything happening there, diplomacy and action. I think that's what you would say. And then we're going to talk about like the Tasmanian Parliament and also about Ali France.
The opening of the Australian Parliament.
Yeah, the opening of the Australian Parliament.
Tasmanian election, yes.
Tasmanian election. Yeah. But great, let's get started. Did you want to lead off with the conference?
Sure. So 28 countries have condemned Israel's actions in Palestine, particularly the whole craziness of managing the food aid and then killing all these people lining up for food, etc. It's really gone beyond the pale. And so now 28 countries have said this is unconscionable and totally illegal and they can't stand by it. The declaration's been made. The big question is, what will they do, right? Will they put sanctions on Israel or what will they do? And of course, the US is not abiding by this and staying by Israel. But it's a significant moment because everyone in the world's been horrified by this, and it has to end at some point, this whole thing, but not sure what the conclusion will be.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you say beyond the pale, and I think we both agree that it has been beyond the pale from the beginning. I mean, even before this recent conflict started, Palestinian people have been undergoing a very existential, bizarre, horrific existence really in the occupied Palestinian territories. So, well, I think a few weeks ago we were all thinking it didn't seem like anyone was making any changes, no matter how many protests happened, no matter how many sanctions were threatened, nothing seemed to be changing. The IDF seemed to be heading forward in the same direction that they have been heading. They have started naming the creation of a humanitarian city, which sounds all well and good when you hear the words humanitarian city because they've obviously got someone good in marketing in charge of that. But if you look into the actual reality of the situation, the design of this city is like concentration camps. And it exists in order to concentrate all the Palestinians into one place and, then ethnic cleansing, etc., etc. So yeah, recently, obviously, we've seen these humanitarian aid centers sponsored by the US and by Israel handing out food, but then there have been shootings of people lining up to get food, children. Most recently, I think there was 52 people killed at an aid center. And, these like horrifying levels of innocent people being murdered, essentially, I would call it murder.
It's really fascinating to think about what the long-term impact of this is on the brand of Israel and for Jewish people globally, because it's really at the point, isn't it ironic that there's people talking about these concentration camps, given the history, etc. That's the fascinating thing, where this will end and what will people's perception of Israel and unfortunately Jewish people beyond Israel be as a result of this.
I think it's if you take away all the horrifying at it, it's an interesting study of how humans can react to certain situations, right? I think we think the best of ourselves. We think if we were in a situation like the Holocaust, everything would be fine and we would make a statement and we would stand up. And in reality, would you? And I think what you're seeing is the people who live in Israel at the moment, the Israeli citizens, how certain national pride and etc. and, like hatred for another ethnicity can, convince you to do horrific things. So finally, Francesca Albanese, I think, has had a big hand in calling for conferences and meetings that don't necessarily include the US and UK. And that has been now resulting in this meeting that happened in Colombia with a few powers such as Brazil, South America, also Spain, and a few others who have quite progressive governments and have decided that they wait any longer. They're not going to let anything else happen. So hopefully they'll be able to do something. I even saw the other day that North Korea said that they recognize Palestine as an independent state and that they don't believe Israel is doing good things in that area, which is
Yeah. So we will keep watching refunds.
one more thing is that, quite interestingly, obviously there's still been a lot of protests, but the other day on the island of Syros in Greece, an Israeli cruise ship with about 1,600 Israeli citizens on board was set to dock in Syros for a nice Greek holiday, and there was enough protesters that they didn't let them disembark onto the island and they had to get turned back, and I'm not sure where they ended up. But I think that's quite interesting how everyday regular people are really beginning to stand
Back
up
to my
against
point
this.
about what the impact on brand Israel will
Yeah,
be.
exactly. So let's continue
So
with
let's
the
move on
Epstein.
to the Epstein files. This is becoming increasingly frustrating for President Trump, which clearly shows he's quite worried about this. Congress is now calling to interview Ghislaine Maxwell, who, as you may or may not know, is in jail for some long period of time for trafficking underage women for Epstein. And so that's very interesting that Congress is going to interview her and when the Epstein files will be released. And there's been all sorts of talk about, do they exist, do they not exist? I think
I mean, the Epstein files exist.
yeah, but with a list of names of people, I mean, that's a real question. And most recently, there was supposedly this birthday card that Trump had sent to Epstein, and he denies it was him or his handwriting, etc. And sort of that's very interesting to see where that will come to. But this could be. Already the MAGA movement is upset about this with Trump. I read quite a few million people are sort of disappointed in this and sort of they're questioning their vote for Trump in a way. They're super pleased with what he's doing, but they feel like he's not being transparent with this. And so it'll be interesting, the political fallout for him, depending on what happens.
Definitely, I think this is massive. This is probably the biggest thing to happen so far in his political career. I mean, I think that why would you be so hesitant to release something unless there's obviously something condemning you? I think without a doubt there are some implications for Trump's own actions within the Epstein files, or at least his friendship and his links to him in the past could have the potential to tie him into the crimes as well, simply just from obviously having spent a lot of time together, a lot of photos showing them, you know, surrounded by like various women and some of the women who were victims of the sex trafficking. So yeah, it's going to have a huge effect, and I like to think that, maybe we forgive Trump for being a sexual predator in terms of sexual assault because that's what it seemed America did because they voted for him. So essentially they forgive him for that and they don't care. But I think surely, right, once you find out someone is a pedophile and that they have trafficked children, surely that's like the line that you can't cross. Surely that's the line in which most Americans go, I can't vote for someone or believe in someone if they think that way about children.
I think the interesting thing is, will a lot of people just say, "Oh, this is yet another conspiracy," or will they really believe it? That's always the question in the US. Is it going to be so conclusive? It probably won't be. There'll be some question about it, and so therefore you just say, "Oh, this is a conspiracy," you know, and people buy that line, right? That's what they bought
Yeah,
up till
definitely.
now. So yeah, it will be fascinating to see. But certainly hotting up, and it's the topic of the moment. And Trump is desperately trying to change the topic. He just announced a big trade agreement with Japan today,
That's one deflection.
which is, his strategy to deflect.
Another deflection I've heard is that he has some kind of medical issue that they've all been treating, so that's been put into the media as well. Another deflection is I saw an interview of him being asked about Ghislaine Maxwell, and they were asking, do you know anything about that? He said, no, I know nothing about that. I find it quite fascinating how Even though he's the president of the United States, he gets away with knowing nothing about what his entire government is doing at all times, and everyone kind of pats him on the back. That's his way of avoiding difficulty. But they were asking him about this, and he went, well, I know nothing about that, but Obama? Obama did some illegal things. He did treason, actually. He committed treason. Let's look into that. And it was such an insane jump to such a, like, ridiculously opposite end of the spectrum conversation. But, he got away with it. They started talking about Obama.
Potentially in another week or two, we will have moved on from Epstein. That's the process of this stuff. But it'll be interesting whether that happens or not.
Another massive update on this whole Epstein files situation, crisis, I guess you could call it. At least that's what Trump is probably viewing it as, a crisis. Is that Congress has shut down a day early because they've been dealing with the Epstein files for a while, I think waiting to vote on a particular aspect of it. But in order to avoid dealing with it, they shut down Congress a day early. So they're not going in on Friday.
Okay, so they go in next week, or is it?
So I don't know. This has been a new thing that's come out. So they're really trying to avoid it the best they can, but eventually everything will come out.
Oh, interesting.
Moving on.
Good point. So Albo's had a long and very fruitful trip to China. Panda diplomacy, met the pandas, spent time on the Great Wall of China as previous prime ministers did, Malcolm Fraser, I should say, and Gough Whitlam, etc. in the past. And so he was trying to relive some of that history and such. Had some formal meetings and informal meetings with Xi, the president of China, and supposedly his response was they built somewhat of a trusted relationship, and they spoke personally during this lunch about their lives and that sort of thing. And so I think a very successful trip, given where we've been in the past with our relationship with China. And it's so important because it's by far our largest trading partner. Something like 30% of our exports go to China. More than 30%. So it's way bigger than the US. The US is like 12% or something. So it's really important to keep that in mind. And of course, he was very careful with his words because the US is watching this and he's got to make this balancing act on the fence between China and the US in this regard. So it's going to be fascinating over coming months with the whole AUKUS inquiry and what happens there. How he balances that with our relationship with China.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. And I think it's probably fascinating for the world to look to Australia and, the decisions we're making on who to trust, China or US. Because obviously, traditionally, we've been a Western power and we've always fallen in line with the UK and the US. But now we're seeing a lot of countries in our region turn to China and begin to have far greater trust for China than the US. I even think we're getting to the point where I'm beginning to look at China as a more trustworthy person than the US, simply because it's clear what their interests are and it's clear what moves they will make. Not that they're doing something that's particularly moral most of the time, but it's slightly more predictable maybe than the erratic decisions of the Trump administration. So I know it was quite interesting with Albo on his trip to China. They're building this new city called the Great City or something, and he was very fascinated by it all because he's a bit of an infrastructure nerd. So I heard that he was, inspired by the fact that this city was gonna halve its emissions and halve its like resource use and halve the space it even needs for people to live on, but have the same amount of people as another city. And he wants to bring these ideas back to Australia.
Well, it is impressive what China's doing. They're technologically leading the world in some aspects in terms of their building of cities and ports and their robotics and their AI is catching up to the US. Some people would say they're more advanced in some ways, and certainly from an environmental point of view, they're on board with Paris and moving forward with all this, unlike
they're
the
making
US.
big changes, especially as the world's largest steel manufacturer, right? I think steel manufacturing uses a lot of carbon emissions.
Yep.
So if they make big changes on that, it could make a really big difference to, world's targets.
Anyway, people often ask me, it's really interesting. People say, well, what has Labor done? I think one of the big successes of the first term of Labor is stabilizing the relationship with China. And that alone is a huge benefit to the Australian economy because the relationship was toxic before. And you can say, we should talk to them more about human rights, etc. But Albo's right in terms of we've got to have a good relationship, and there's some things we won't agree on, and that's the case. And we'll tell them when we don't agree, but do it respectfully. And
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think we're getting to the point where we don't have a choice, right? And I'm not sure how much power we have to really hold our ground. And when the two biggest powers are the US and China, and they're both, conducting pretty horrific human rights abuses, it's hard to really pick between the two. It's two bad options. But yeah, we've seen them make a lot of changes in recent years. And I think that, like, Albo and the current Australian government and the past one, they've worked really hard to improve our relationships with the Pacific in
yes,
general and the rest of Asia as well, in which the liberal governments before that mostly ignored. They only wanted to strengthen our relationships with European countries and other Western leaders. Even that, they messed up a relationship with France for a bit. So, you know, I think that the Labour government has an excellent focus on foreign policy and has really worked hard to achieve the relationships we have.
but it's interesting. A lot of people don't give them much credit for it. It's really interesting. People give people more credit for domestic issues than foreign issues typically.
Isn't that just because most people don't have enough time to be reading about foreign policy and, the stuff that affects you every day when you go to work is probably going to affect you more than something you just hear on the news once a day.
That's true. So, and again, the opposition was saying I was spending too much time in China, having too good a time. It was kind of lame and interesting. So, the other big thing that happened was an election in Tasmania. The Tasmanian Labor Party withdrew support for the government, no confidence in the government, so an election was called. Liberal Party won the most seats, but not a majority. They need to form a government with others. There's potential that Labor could actually form a government if they combined everyone together. But, Labor went backwards in terms of their primary vote because I think, the public doesn't like to have to go to elections too often. And the result is not dissimilar to the result before the election. So it fundamentally was a bit of a waste of time.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess what else do you do in that situation, though? If the electorate is so divided that parties are getting equal share of the vote, essentially that's what it is. I mean, I just think the Tasmanian Parliament is a little bit freaky. Like they need to get their
Well, one
act
of the big
together.
issues is this football stadium that they're planning to build to be an AFL stadium. And it's divided the state really because it's a huge expense for them, and it's not the um, biggest state in the country, and it's a huge
Exactly.
cost to them, and people would rather have that spent on hospitals or whatever
For
else.
sure. And of course, as well as that, the salmon farming. So we've got the two main issues there. The parties are all very divided, people are very divided, and that's essentially what's causing this stalemate in the parliament. So,
Salmon burgers at the football stadium,
oh
huh?
God. So we'll keep you updated on that.
And
Hopefully they can sort their shit out.
and then yesterday the Australian Parliament opened, first time since Labor's election victory. It's the first time you saw the massive number of Labor MPs and the smaller number of Liberal MPs in the Parliament. And so that was interesting. A lot of the new MPs, the most diverse cabinet in history, many, many, many more women in the Labor caucus and the Labor ministry. And one of the more interesting characters was Ali France, who beat Peter Dutton in Dickson. She lost her husband to cancer. She lost her eldest son to cancer. She was in a terrible accident where she got hit by this car in a car park and lost her leg. So pretty impressive. And she ran against Dutton once, and then she did it the second time. And in fact, her father was an MP, and it took him 3 times to get elected. I don't think in Dickson, but still in Queensland. So she's following in a family tradition. But, her story of courage and resilience was really, really impressive. So fascinating. And, I think the hardest job in the Australian Parliament is the Liberal Party leader. And so it'll be interesting to see how she goes going forward because I don't feel like she has the full support of her cabinet, people like Angus Taylor and
Ali
others.
France.
Yeah, Susan Lee.
Yeah.
Um, and so she's got a tough job. It'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. And I think one of some of the key issues there will be, will they keep to their net zero by 2050, quotas for women in the Liberal Party, etc., etc. So that will be fascinating to see how that plays out. And also how the Greens negotiate. They have the balance of power in the Senate, and they're sort of a diminished party since their leader was not re-elected, etc. And the founder of the Greens has left the party or been dismissed of the party, saying it's become a woke, transgender focused, obsessed party. And, so they've had some damaging challenges or some political challenges
But I
themselves.
think that's what people love them for. Maybe he's leaving the party, but I think that people are still voting for them. As I've said to you before, the electoral system is kind of bizarre because we have the single member system that we do. Even though the Greens got just as many votes as they did last election, they have less parliamentary seats. They actually have the highest number of Senate seats that they've ever had in history because that is how many votes they got proportionally in comparison to all the other parties, right? But just because they happened to be running against Labour in a lot of seats and because people had a lot of support for Labour in this election and really wanted them to beat out Peter Dutton, I think that caused them to. But I don't think it's the end of the Greens in
No, I
any.
don't think, I'm not saying it's the end of the Greens, but
Yeah.
they are somewhat challenged versus where
Mm.
they were before. So it'll be interesting how compliant they are with Labor, and likewise how Susan Lee's approach to working with Labor where it makes sense. First test will be the reduction in HEX, 20% reduction for students of their HEX debt and that sort of thing. And that's the first thing. And then there's minimum wage changes, etc.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
And then the productivity summit coming up, which is the big challenge of the second term,
Ooh, the productivity summit. Well,
because Australia's lagging in its productivity,
oh God,
big
yeah.
time.
So we'll look forward to doing an episode on that in the future. Thank you guys all so much for joining us. I think that's all for today.
Yes, thank you for joining us. Remember to like us and tell your friends, and please, we'd love some questions. Thank you.